Week 12 of the fantasy season is here, so you know exactly what that means. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single quarterback and tight end, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 12 of the fantasy season. All right, very quickly here, 4 teams on bye week in week 12, the Denver Broncos, the LA Chargers, the Miami Dolphins, and the Washington Commanders. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick it off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Bills traveling to face the Texans. Let's start with Josh Allen and the Buffalo Bills. A monstrous performance in Week 11 for Josh Allen. 3 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing touchdowns, 44.6 fantasy points, reminding us why no matter what, under any circumstances, do you ever bench Josh Allen in fantasy football. He's been over 20 fantasy points in every game this year except for 2. And the ceiling is always incredibly high. He is now the quarterback 1 on the season in fantasy football. And yeah, it's a short week, which I'm never a big fan of. And yeah, he is facing the Houston Texans, who have allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. But ultimately, it's still Josh Allen, and you got to roll with them, and we're not going to break it down any further than that. Dalton Kincaid out this past week dealing with that hamstring issue. Unclear if he's going to be able to play this week. It's a short week. Looks like the early reports are indicating that he's not going to practice early in the week, so I don't really have a ton of confidence that he's going to be able to suit up and play in this Week 12 matchup, and it is a tough matchup. The Texans, the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but I still like Dalton Kincaid. I still think he is startable if he's able to go, but I don't have a lot of confidence that he's actually going to be able to play here in Week 12 of the season, so we'll just have to wait and see. Anybody else here? Dawson Knox, Jackson Haas, they're just going to be sits for me moving into the week. I'm not going to consider them, especially in a tough matchup. Now, we look to the Texans side of things. We got Davis Mills as a starting quarterback in Week 11, 16.3 fantasy points, 274 passing yards, and 1 passing touchdown. So 28 fantasy points in Week 10, 16.3 this past week. He's been okay, I mean, overall, in relief of C.J. Stroud, who is remaining in concussion protocol, listed as a non-participant in Monday's practice. So once again, don't know if C.J. Stroud's going to play this week or not. It is a short week. We all know this, Thursday Night Football. So we'll see. But either way, I don't really have a ton of confidence in starting either of these guys in fantasy. The Bills have allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I know we're dealing with a lot of injuries and stuff going on right now at this point in the season, but I don't really see any circumstance for a lot of you guys out there where you need to go out and start a player like Davis Mills in Superflex, double quarterback. There's always a scenario where you might be desperate enough, but ultimately I would avoid both these quarterbacks going into the week. Dalton Schultz remains a decent streaming option. We've liked him as a streaming option over the past 3 weeks or so. He's at 11.1 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, and he's really the second pass catcher on this team behind Nico Collins. So I think he remains a good streaming option, but he is dealing with a shoulder injury. We're going to have to monitor that as the week progresses. As long as he plays, I still think he is streamable this week, but bear in mind, the Buffalo Bills have allowed the fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends on the season, so it's not particularly a good matchup to say the least. So we'll see how it all shakes out. But there's my Thursday night predictions for quarterbacks and tight ends as we move into Week 12. And I'm headed straight to Underdog to take Josh Allen to score a rushing touchdown here in Week 12 of the season. It is risky. The Texans have given up 0 rushing touchdowns so far on the season to opposing quarterbacks. But I think Josh Allen, the way he's playing, could absolutely break that streak. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog are getting a free NFL Pick Em to use towards Week 12 NFL action. Take that free Pick Em, take Josh Allen to score a rushing touchdown. If both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. So don't forget to sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below if you want to take advantage of all of their exclusive Week 12 NFL offers. Moving into the early window on Sunday, we're going to have the Colts traveling to face the Chiefs. Let's start with the Colts side of things. Danny Dimes and the Colts on bye week in Week 11. The last 2 games we've seen Daniel Jones active, Weeks 9 and 10, 16.5 or more fantasy points, but only had a ceiling of 17 fantasy points, no more than one passing touchdown in each of the last 2 games. 3 fumbles in each of the last 2 games, and at least 1 interception in each of the last 2 games, including 3 interceptions in week 9. So definitely has not been playing at a super high ceiling, but he's at least doing enough to get you a floor. He gets the Chiefs this week on the road, top 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy points allowed. Not the greatest matchup here, but I would expect coming out of the bye week that he's going to be able to at least get you guys a floor. This should be a competitive matchup. So I think at the end of the day, Daniel Jones is a solid enough start. Maybe not my favorite this week, but I do like to trust teams coming out of the bye week for the most part. So we'll leave him in the start category, but I don't know if he has a crazy high ceiling. Tyler Warren just has to remain as a start on a week-in, week-out basis. Once again, the Chiefs giving up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. It is a tough matchup, but Tyler Warren, tight end 3 so far on the season and half in full PPR, 17.9 fantasy points the last time we saw him play in week 10. Got to keep him in your starting lineups no matter what. Then we move to the Chiefs, who are in desperate need of a win now with 5 losses on the season after suffering a loss in week 11 on the road against the Denver Broncos. Just 14.3 fantasy points for Patrick Mahomes this past week. The Colts, a top 12 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position, much softer against the tight end position where they're bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed. But I'm going to expect that this is going to be a competitive matchup. This is going to be a good game script for both teams. I'm actually expecting more offense and defense in this matchup. We'll see how it shakes out. Ultimately, I think Mahomes can get back to a good ceiling. We haven't really seen, we're still seeing pretty good usage out of Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce, Kareem Hunt, but a lot of the other players on this team that were making plays throughout the course of the beginning of the season haven't really been showing up. I'm expecting good things out of the Chiefs offense here in week 12, not giving up on them. And then they get a much softer defense in week 13 against the Dallas Cowboys. So ultimately, I think they can kind of bounce back in the next 2 weeks, and this is a really big game for them. They really need to try and go out and win this game before they face the Texans, Chargers, Titans, and Broncos again. And then the Raiders, although that doesn't really matter for fantasy. But yeah, this is, they're kind of in a must-win situation at this point in the season. So I'm not giving up on the Chiefs offense. I still think Mahomes and Kelce are both viable starters. And like I said, it is a good spot for Travis Kelce, who is your tight end 2 on the season so far. I've been talking week in, week out, encouraging you guys to keep Travis Kelce in your starting lineups. He's not washed. He's not just Mr. Taylor Swift. He's been very, very productive on the season. 24.1 fantasy points this past week against the Denver Broncos. 13 targets, 9 catches, 91 receiving yards, and a touchdown. And like I said, the Colts are bottom 5 against opposing tight ends in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position. So it's a great spot for him. He's one of my favorite starts out of all the quarterbacks and tight ends that we're talking about in this matchup. So let's just keep everybody in our lineups moving into this week 12 matchup. All right, next up we have the Seahawks traveling to face the Titans. Let's kick it off with Sam Darnold. Kind of seeing ghosts the last 2 weeks or so. A 4-interception game this past week for Sammy D. 29 of 44, 279 passing yards, 8.2 fantasy points. 8.2 or less fantasy points in his last 2 games. 9.6 or less in 3 out of the last 4, with a 28.2 fantasy day squeezed in between there of all teams, of course, against mine, the Washington Commanders. Nonetheless, on the road here this week against the Tennessee Titans, who are definitely not a great team against opposing quarterbacks, bottom 12 against the position, although this is a defense that's kind of sneaky at times, but still they're not good overall. So I am expecting a decent enough game out of Sam Darnold, a kind of a bounce back spot here, even on the road. I don't know if he's my favorite start, probably more of a low-end start, but what we do know is he does know how to get the ball to Jackson Smith and Jigba at the end of the day, and this run game looked really fluent last week, getting Kenneth Walker a lot more opened up here, and Charbonnet always has opportunity, and this is a soft run defense for the Titans. So I think that this offense can get things moving, and I ultimately like Sam Darnold this week, and I also think that A.J. Barner is a solid streamer. We've been talking about A.J. Barner for weeks and weeks here on the channel. I know he has some kind of goose egg type performances, 1.9 or less fantasy points in 2 of the last 4 matchups. but 11.5 or more in the other two matchups, and still 10.8 or more fantasy points in every game except for 4 on the season. So difficult to trust, but he gets enough involvement in this offense that I think he's a really solid streaming option. Did have 11 targets this past week, 10 catches as well. Those were both season highs for AJ Barner. So I like him this week. Going up against the Titans, who are a good team against tight ends, giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but still, at the end of the day, I think he's a solid streamer. Then we look to the Titan side of things. Cam Ward, Chicken Conquo, any other tight end, I don't care. This is an awful matchup against a really good Seahawks defense. And I mean, like, technically speaking here, the Seahawks are kind of middle of the pack against quarterbacks, and they actually struggle against tight ends, but I don't care. There's enough good players on this Seahawks defense that I just have no faith in the Titans offense. I've had no faith in them all season long. So Cam Ward, Chicken Conquo, both going to be sits for me here in week 12. Moving along, we got the Vikings traveling to face the Packers. Let's start with the Vikings side of things. JJ McCarthy, what in the world is going on? 16 of 32 this past week, 150 passing yards. 1 passing touchdown, 2 picks, just 8 fantasy points. He's got progressively worse every week as the starter for the Vikings. 19.9 fantasy points, 16.7. And like I said, 8 points this past week. And I don't want to trust him whatsoever against this Packers defense, giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. He's been extremely inaccurate, not on the same page as the wide receivers. I'm hoping, crossing my fingers, that this gets resolved, that this gets fixed, and it looks better as the season goes on, but I'm not trusting it. Even in super flex, double quarterback, I'm staying away from McCarthy until further notice. And TJ Hawkinson's in that same boat. I mean, he really hasn't been productive this year. 10.3 or more fantasy points in 2 games on the year, 1 game in which he scored a touchdown, the other one in which he had a season high of 9 targets. Other than that, 9.1 or less, 6.9 this past week, 6 targets, 3 catches, 39 receiving yards. I just can't do it with TJ Hawkinson. And really, outside of Justin Jefferson, Aaron Jones, and maybe Jordan Addison as a flex option or like a low-end wide receiver too, I just have no interest in this Vikings offense whatsoever right now. But like I said, I am hoping that it improves for all of us who do own any shares of Vikings players. Nonetheless, Jordan Love and the Packers, we had J-Lo as a streamer this past week against the Giants. It's a stiffer matchup this week, to say the least, against the Vikings, who've given up the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But I still like this spot. Divisional matchup at home. I think like 17-ish fantasy points is about what Jordan Love can get you this week. So solid enough streamer. It is worth noting, got a little banged up this past week. It looks like he's going to be good to go, though. Like, he was able to finish week 11, and I think he'll be able to play week 12 as well and be good to go. So, Josh Jacobs questionable, probably not going to play this game. But I think that the Packers will pull through here and be just fine. But they have been dealing with a lot of injuries, including my guy Tucker Kraft, who I still refuse to forget about. But Luke Musgrave has not quite had the same impact as Tucker Kraft, to say the least. 0.9 fantasy points this past week for Musgrave, 2 targets, 1 catch, -1 receiving yards, 0.9 fantasy points. So he's going to be a sit for me. Unfortunately, for quarterbacks and tight ends, this is really not one of the better matchups overall going into week 12. Let's move along to the Jets, who are traveling to face the Ravens. Let's start with Tyrod Taylor. Not going to be Justin Fields this week. He is getting benched. He was actually pretty good in fantasy this past week. We talked about him on the waiver video. And I was saying, look at some of these matchups coming up. Justin Fields always has rushing upside. He showed that even against a good Patriots run defense, but that's all out the window, at least for week 12. We'll see how things continue to shake out here. We're going to get Tyrod Taylor as the starting quarterback. We've got kind of a mixed bag here. He played a little bit in week 7. 4.1 fantasy points against the Panthers. Solid enough performance in week 3 with 17.6 fantasy points, and played a little bit in relief of Justin Fields in week 2. Also in relief of Fields in week 7. So 8.3 fantasy points. Not a lot to really build off of here other than that matchup against Tampa Bay. But for what it's worth, I mean, the Ravens are not the greatest team, 19th overall against opposing quarterbacks, but they have been getting healthier. They have been playing better defensively. It's a home game for the Ravens, so you'd have to be really desperate in a super flex format. And even then, I'm talking maybe 15-ish points is what I would predict for Tyrod Taylor, with no Garrett Wilson and A.D. Mitchell and John Mechie at wide receiver. So he's going to be a sit for me moving into the week. Mason Taylor also going to be a sit for me. 4 targets, 4 catches, 30 receiving yards this past week. Not awful. 7 fantasy points. But the Patriots are actually surprisingly bad against opposing tight ends. And the Ravens, while they have been struggling against most positions fantasy-wise, they've been top 10 against opposing tight ends. So no interest in Mason Taylor. Then let's move to the Ravens, because I think a lot of people are going to be worried about Lamar Jackson. 2 interceptions this past week. No passing touchdowns, no rushing touchdowns, 193 yards through the air, 6.7 fantasy points. But it was against a good Browns defense, and, I don't think the Vikings defense are anything to sneeze at, who he played the previous week. And I think that he can bounce back here against the Jets at home pretty easily, as the Jets are a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks on the season, and they've only gotten worse in terms of their defensive lineup. So it's Lamar Jackson. Don't overthink it. He's going to be fine. I can't really think of a lot of other. If you own Lamar Jackson, I know he was hurt for a little bit, so maybe you have some other options on your team. But for the most part, it's Lamar Jackson. Just start him. Don't overthink it. Mark Andrews, I've continued to call him a start basically week after week, especially since Lamar Jackson has come back. And since Lamar Jackson has been back in action, Mark Andrews has had 10.4 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games and 3 touchdowns in that stretch as well. So I'm keeping Mark Andrews in the start category. The ceiling's not always massively high, but you just got to keep rolling with them. Pretty safe floor. Jets, middle of the pack against tight end, 16th overall. So I still like Mark Andrews. And Isaiah Likely, really just not seeing that production. Doesn't really need to be rostered at this point in the season. Next up, we have the Giants traveling to face the Lions. Let's start with the Giants side of things. At the time of recording this, Jackson Dart still in concussion protocol. Unclear if he's going to be able to play in Week 12 or not. If he doesn't play, looks like we'll get another Jameis Winston start. Jameis was 19-29 this past week. 201 passing yards, no passing touchdowns, a pick, 10 rushing yards, and did have a rushing touchdown, also had a lost fumble. So very disappointing in kind of weird fashion against a good Packers run defense. The Giants, were able to run the football better. Jameis Winston didn't really give this offense or their passing attack offensively any boost like some were expecting. It was a tough matchup overall against the Packers at the end of the day, but also I think disappointing because we're used to seeing Jameis go out there and sling it a bit, but it's not like anybody, I don't think a lot of people at least, were really relying on Jameis Winston last week. Nonetheless, he will get the Lions this week, 21st overall against opposing quarterbacks, so it is a better matchup, but I'm not going to trust Jameis Winston in starting lineups. However, if Jackson Dart is able to play, I think he is definitely still a startable option, as he has had 17 or more fantasy points in every game this year and has been over 19 fantasy points in every game except for 3 that he started on the year as well. So if he plays, I think he's good to go. I thought Theo Johnson could be a bit sneaky this past week, hoping that we would see a bump in passing offense, but also because the Packers are weak against tight ends. 4 targets, 3 catches, 36 receiving yards. Worth noting, the one target that he did not catch was a defensive pass interference in the end zone, almost scored a touchdown, but just 6.6 fantasy points. Gets the Lions this week. They are pretty good against tight ends, 13th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to the positions, but I'm just leaving Theo Johnson in the streaming category. With these kind of streamable tight ends, they're not always going to have great games, but he has still seen double-digit fantasy performances in every game except for 3 since week 4 of the season. And ultimately has been a viable streaming option. So we'll just leave him there. Then we move to the Lions side of things. Jared Goff, just 13.1 fantasy points this past week against that Eagles defense, which is looking pretty dang good. But this week he gets the Giants, who have given up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks thus far on the season. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Goff back at home here in Week 12 after being on the road for 2 weeks straight. The Lions suffering I don't want to say embarrassing loss, but a loss to the Eagles, loss to the Vikings in Week 9, and only have beaten the Commanders in the last 3 weeks. I'm going to go ahead and say that the Lions going to be in one of these moods where they're going to put their foot on the pedal, they're going to keep it on the gas, and they're going to put up a lot of offensive points, and Goff's going to have one of those solid golf games at home. So we'll leave him in the start category. No Sam Laporta. He's hanging out on IR with a back injury, and his future for the season is a little murky. That left Brock Wright as the starting tight end for the Lions. 7 targets, 2 catches, 8 receiving yards, 2.8 fantasy points. But the 7 targets is encouraging, so maybe keep our eyes on Brock Wright. But the Giants, while this defense is not good, they are top 12 in terms of fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So I don't know if this is the best matchup, plus not enough for us to even want to stream him. But I do think we should keep a close eye on his usage, especially if we get more and more negative reports coming out about Sam Laporta for the 2025 season. Next up, we will have the Steelers traveling to face the Bears. Let's start with Aaron Rodgers and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Rodgers dealing with a wrist fracture in his left wrist. His status this week is uncertain, listed as questionable. Wanted to return in week 11. The Steelers would not allow him to do so. He finished with 9.4 fantasy points, 9 of 15, 116 passing yards, a passing touchdown, 8 yards on the ground. Mason Rudolph came in for him. Mason Rudolph was not bad. 12 of 16, 127 passing yards and a touchdown. But that was against the Steelers' pass defense, which has been notoriously pretty bad on the season. And the Bears' pass defense, certainly not good, but they are very opportunistic. They have a league-high 15 interceptions. They are one of 2 teams, the Jacksonville Jaguars being the other one, who are over 10 interceptions on the season. So I don't really know if there's a great formula for Rodgers or Rudolph this week. I'm going to leave them both as sits, and I don't really anticipate either of them being, uberly good in terms of fantasy production. Anyways, is uberly a word? I don't know. But anyways, Rodgers had 12 or less fantasy points in the last 2 games that he's fully started. So there sits for me. Freiermuth and Jonnu Smith, I just have no interest in. I mean, they just got a phenomenal matchup against the Bengals, and they combined for 2.9 fantasy points. Worth noting that Darnell Washington had that really cool catch where he looked like a literal 50-year-old man playing football with 3-year-olds. He did have 10.7 fantasy points, and that's kind of the problem with the Steelers. Anytime they do have a good matchup for tight ends, they utilize all 3 of these tight ends, so it's too difficult to call. They'll be playing the Bears this week. It's not as good of a matchup, but the Bears are still bottom 12 against tight ends. But yeah, I just don't trust any of these guys. Don't want to stream them. They're all sits for me. Let's move to the Bears. Caleb Williams, not so great this past week, 10.3 fantasy points after having 25 or more fantasy points in the previous 2 games. No passing touchdowns, no rushing touchdowns, 193 passing yards, 26 yards on the ground. I do think he can bounce back here at home, as the Steelers are a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks so far on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. Something about this Steelers defensive line still makes me a little bit worried for the Bears this week in terms of their passing attack, but ultimately, I think this is a good spot for Caleb Williams, guys like Rome Odunze. I think they can get it done, Caleb Williams can bring at least a safe floor. I know he's been a bit up and down. I was close to putting him in a lower category, but I'm going to leave him as a start. Then in terms of the Bears tight ends, we saw 4 targets, 3 catches, 7 fantasy points to Colston Loveland this past week. Cole Kmet, on the other hand, 5 targets, 5 catches, 45 receiving yards, 9.5 fantasy points. But ultimately, I just don't really feel like we can trust these guys, especially with Kmet, back and healthy over the last 3 weeks. They're not facing the Bengals, where Loveland had 29.8 fantasy points. They used both of these guys this past week. Loveland was on the field for 75% of the snaps. Cole Kmet also on the field for 79% of the snaps. So we're not really seeing an advantage to either tight end. Against the Steelers, here's not a bad matchup. They are 27th overall against opposing tight ends. But once again, I just can't trust either of these tight ends. So really, for quarterbacks, tight ends in this matchup, I'm only looking to start Caleb Williams. All right, final game of the early window will be the Patriots traveling to face the Bengals. Let's go ahead and start with the Patriots side of things. Drake May continues his MVP caliber type season, but wasn't that great this past week for fantasy. Just 15.4 fantasy points, 25 of 34, 281 passing yards, and a passing touchdown. But I guess the Bengals this week, they've given up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. Just keep rolling with Drake May. Nothing to talk about here. Quarterback 2 so far on the fantasy season absolutely needs to be in your starting lineups in a great matchup here. Hunter Henry, very strong streaming option. I was close to putting him just in the start category because it's the Bengals. They're the worst team in the league against opposing tight ends. But if you own him, I think he is definitely in the streaming category, but I wouldn't just call him a flat-out start because he hasn't given us a double-digit fantasy performance since September, and ultimately the Patriots just spread the football around so much to different wide receivers, different playmakers. I think Trayvon Henderson, even Ramondre Stevenson, if he's active, are going to have big days running the football. So I do like Henry. Do think he's a good streaming option because it's the Bengals, but I'm not going to call him more than that. Now we move to the Bengals side of things. I was all in on Joe Flacco this past week. I think I got a little bit too excited. I mean, it's not like I was telling you guys to go start him over like viable starters, but he's one of my favorite streaming options. Or if you were hurting at quarterback, I put him in the nuclear video. I really thought he would have another great week against the Steelers like he did in week 7. But just 10.8 fantasy points, 23 of 40, 199 passing yards, a passing touchdown, and a pick. I was close to honestly still leaving him in the streaming category here in week 12, but now we know Jamar Chase not going to play this week, dealing with his consequences of Spitgate. And, T. Higgins, Chase Brown, Noah Fant, there's other options on this team, even Andre Uzavis, but at the end of the day, just don't feel great here. This Patriots defense, certainly nothing to sneeze at. So Flacco, back in the sit category, but that's not to say that he can't be a start as the weeks continue to progress here. Noah Fant, 6.6 fantasy points this past week. Mike Gesicki still on IR. I forget every week to take Mike Gesicki off the list, but we'll just leave him, whatever. Noah Fant has had some streamable moments throughout the course of the season, and it is a good matchup. The Patriots have struggled against tight ends, bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position, but ultimately, I'm just going to go ahead and leave all the Bengals tight ends in the sit category moving into week 12. All right, next up we have the Browns traveling to face the Raiders, and we got a new starting quarterback for the Browns this week. Dillon Gabriel, concussion in week 11. He's in concussion protocol, and he's been ruled out for week 12. The reports are now indicating that Shedeur Sanders is expected to make his first official NFL start in week 12. In relief of Gabriel this past week, 14 of 16, 47 passing yards, a pick, 16 yards on the ground, and a fumble. It was not pretty overall. I will say, he's kind of thrown into the game, which if you're a quarterback too on an NFL team, you got to be ready to be thrown into a game, but maybe he was a bit, shook by that. That's why it wasn't his best performance. I don't really think he's going to have a good performance this week, but I do think it could be a little bit better. It's not all, doom and gloom here, but I don't think it's going to be great. The Raiders getting torched by the Cowboys on Monday Night Football at the time I am recording this. Dak Prescott having a big game. But, that defensive line is still has Max Crosby. I still think the Raiders can show up somewhat defensively, especially against a rookie quarterback like Shedeur Sanders. So, long story short, he's going to be a sit. I think that the Raiders defense can definitely do well against him, but I do think he could do a little bit better than I think some are expecting going into the week, but he should not be in any fantasy lineups, even in Superflex or Deep Dynasty, double quarterback. He's still a sit. David Njoku, Harold Fannin, going to be kind of hard to call as the weeks start to move on here because we knew that Dillon Gabriel really liked to throw to opposing tight ends, and now we don't really know what it's going to look like with Sanders at quarterback. And, these guys combined for less than 6 fantasy points this past week. So I'm going to leave them as sits. And on top of that, I know Jake Ferguson scored against the Raiders, but the Raiders have been a top 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing tight ends. So it hasn't even, they haven't even really been, a team that we want to necessarily start opposing tight ends against. So I'm just going to leave them as sits. Don't really want to consider them streaming options moving into week 12. Then we move to the Raiders side of things, and it's going to be what it's been for weeks now. Brock Bowers is a start no matter what. Double-digit fantasy points against the Cowboys in week 11. There's really nothing to break down here. I know this Browns defense is certainly nothing to sneeze at. They're top 12 against every position when it comes to fantasy scoring right now, but still, it's Brock Bowers. He gets the volume. You start him every single week. We know this. Geno Smith, there's always opportunity that he has one of those good Geno Smith games, but as of late, it's mostly just been bad Geno Smith games, and he has thrown an interception in 3 straight games. We're not even going to consider him in Superflex or double quarterback, and who knows, as the week progresses, maybe we'll get some rumblings of Kenny Pickett potentially being a player who could get some volume, but who knows. Ultimately, Geno Smith and Michael Mayer going to be sits. Mayer, this past week, just not enough involvement, and in the recent weeks, just not enough involvement. He gets a little bit, but, To keep it short here, Brock Bowers, the only player at quarterback or tight end that I want in my lineups moving into week 12. Next up, we have the Jaguars traveling to face the Cardinals. Let's start with T-Law and company. Trevor Lawrence just 16 fantasy points this past week, 14 of 22, 153 passing yards, a passing touchdown, a pick, and a rushing touchdown. Gets the Cardinals this week, who just got torched by the Niners. But the Cardinals have still been a top 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks on the season so far. I just don't really feel like I can call Trevor Lawrence, a start or a streaming option. I think if you're desperate enough in Superflex, that's about it for me. I just don't see a very high ceiling the way this team plays right now. They play defense. They run the football. They don't need to throw a lot the way they set up the game script. So ultimately, I'm going to leave him as a sit, but if you're desperate enough, he's like okay for a floor in Superflex, and that's all I can really call him. But yeah, the Cardinals defense did not look so great this past week. Brenton Strange could return from IR this coming week. If not, we'll probably see a little bit of Hunter Long. We'll probably see a little bit of Johnny Munt. Actually, I forgot Hunter Long was hurt, did not play this past week, so we saw more of Johnny Munt, but it doesn't really matter. I don't want to start any Jaguars tight end here in week 12 of the season. We do get Brenton Strange back, though. Let's keep a close eye on his production. Now, Jacoby Brissett, the man, the myth, the legend, 47 completions this past week, an NFL record, 57 passing attempts, 452 passing yards, 2 picks, but 2 passing touchdowns. He has had 19.4 or more fantasy points in every start for the Cardinals and 2 passing touchdowns in every start for the Cardinals as well. We liked him last week as a streaming option. Gonna like him again as a streaming option this week against the Jaguars. Now, this Jaguars defense is sneaky good, but they have struggled against the quarterback position, bottom 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. So, honestly, I think Jacoby Brissett could be in the start category, but I don't really know what type of situation you'd have to be in unless you were only rostering Jaden Daniels and Justin Fields. He's a viable option if you're hurting, but for the most part, single quarterback, he's just going to be a very solid streamer who's getting very close to the start category. But we have talked up Jacoby Brissett for weeks now and really liked him as a strong streamer. So let's just continue to ride that wave. Trey McBride, an absolute start. The tight end 1 in full and half PPR, 27.5 fantasy points, 10 receptions off of 11 targets this past week, 115 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown. He's had a receiving touchdown in every game since Jacoby Brissett has been the starting quarterback, and I don't know if that's going to change this week. The Jaguars giving up the second most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Trey McBride, an absolute must-start tight end here in week 12 of the season. Moving along, we got a divisional matchup with the Eagles traveling to face the Cowboys. Let's start with Jalen Hurts and company. Very disappointing week 11 for Hurts, 14.5 fantasy points, 14 of 28, 135 passing yards, 31 yards on the ground, and a tush-push touchdown. I think we should have 2 separate categories, rushing touchdowns, including quarterback sneaks, and tush-push touchdowns that, obviously probably only Jalen Hurts scores. Nonetheless, not a very good fantasy day, and yeah, there's been concerns around this Eagles offense over the past 2 weeks, but they've carved out 2 wins. The defense is playing very good overall, and this week they are facing the Dallas Cowboys, who've given up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, so don't overthink it. Jalen Hurts has to be in your starting lineup this week. Last time these 2 teams played, back in week 1, Hurts had 24 fantasy points, so let's just move on to the next week. We're in week 12. Jalen Hurts is a solid start. In that week 1 matchup, Dallas Goedert also had 11.4 fantasy points. He hasn't been that productive the last 2 weeks, but he is a top 6 tight end in full PPR right now. I think you got to keep rolling with them. I know he has not been great the last 2 weeks, like I said. Cowboys are just kind of middle of the pack against opposing tight ends, but still, Dallas Goedert staying in the start category for me. Might be a lower end start, might be touchdown dependent, but hey, that's most tight ends who aren't named, like Trey McBride and Brock Bowers and Travis Kelce, right? So I still think he's a solid start. Then Dak Prescott lighting it up against the Raiders, 4 passing touchdowns, over 24 fantasy points. Super solid performance after having 16.4 or less fantasy points in the 2 games before the bye week. It is a tough matchup. The Eagles defense is looking great right now, 11th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks, and obviously in the last 2 weeks they've looked very stout overall, but I'm going to leave Dak Prescott in the start category. It might be closer to a floor here in week 12, but ultimately I still think he is a good start. Then we look to Jake Ferguson, a touchdown on Monday Night Football against the Raiders. Not a super high ceiling game, and really he hasn't given us a high ceiling in the past 3 starts, but I think you got to keep rolling with them. You take away those week 8 and week 9 starts where he combined for 8 fantasy points, and he's had a touchdown in every other game since week 4 of this season. And in the previous 2 games where he didn't score a touchdown, he had 16.8 or more fantasy points. So he has still been plenty productive on the season overall. Yes, it's the Eagles. Yes, it's this defense that's only giving up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but I'm going to imagine offense in this game. I think both teams are going to show up here. I know that might be hard to believe with the way the Eagles are playing as of late, but I still think all the quarterbacks, all the tight ends, solid starts in this matchup in week 12. All right, wrapping up the afternoon window, we're going to have the Falcons traveling to face the Saints. Kirko Chains is back in the mix. Captain Kirk Cousins, you like that? He's now going to be the starter for the Falcons with Michael Penix headed to IR with a knee injury. What do we make of this? I think Kirk Cousins is going to be a sit for me. I don't want to start him right out of the gate here, especially with no Drake London this week, as he is dealing with a knee injury and is considered week to week, but all the reports are indicating that he's likely out this week. Some reports are now indicating that he might play, but I don't think he's actually going to play. So I'm going to, go ahead and anticipate that he's not going to be there. Darnell Mooney's probably going to play, but he's banged up. So don't really love this for this potential passing attack overall at the end of the day. And the Saints are okay, 16th overall against quarterbacks. So I'm not going to start Kirko Chains. Worth picking up in like super flex and stuff like that, but he's going to be a sit for me. I think due to the injuries at wide receiver that we have a risky flex option in Kyle Pitts, but he's had 7.8 or less fantasy points in 3 straight games. So I don't trust him. I think he's very risky. Definitely not my favorite streamer. But once again, due to the injuries at at wide receiver, we could see some volume go to the tight end position in Kyle Pitts, but only if you're truly desperate. Now, I do have Tyler Shuck as a sit, but he was okay in week 10 on the road against the Panthers before the week 11 bye week. 18.9 fantasy points, 282 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. Gets this Falcons defense this week, who seems to be getting worse and worse every week, but they're 15th overall against opposing quarterbacks so far on the season. So definitely not the best here. I think he's a player to watch in like super flex and double quarterback, and could be a player who could have some good matchup-based performances, but here, for most of you guys, in Week 12, he's going to be a sit. I do, however, like Jawan Johnson as a streaming option, as he's really the second primary pass catcher on this team behind Chris Olave. The volume should be there, but the Falcons have given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to tight ends on the season so far. Bear that in mind, but the Saints are coming out of their bye week, extra time to rest, prepare, all that stuff, and Jawan Johnson has had double-digit fantasy points in each of the last 4 games, regardless of who's been playing at quarterback. So he is a solid streaming option. We'll see how things shake out in this divisional matchup in Week 12. Moving along, we have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Rams on Sunday Night Football. Let's start with Baker Money Maker himself. 17.8 fantasy points in week 11 on the road against the Bills. Threw a touchdown, ran for a touchdown, had a lost fumble, had an interception, 173 passing yards, 39 rushing yards. Still gave you a pretty safe floor. Baker finds a way to get it done on a week-in, week-out basis. I'm envisioning offense in this matchup, although that Rams defense is, pretty dang good. But at the end of the day, I think that the Bucs are going to continue to throw the football in this matchup, find a way to stay in this game, and that Rams defense specifically very good against the run, so the Bucs will need to throw. I don't really care who's healthy, who's not healthy. If Ibuka had a down week this past week, whatever. Baker finds a way to get it done. I like him as a start here in week 12 of the season. And ultimately, I think that Cade Otton is still a solid streaming option at the tight end position. The Rams are a bottom 10 unit against opposing tight ends. I know Cade Otton was not so great this past week, but the Bills have been really stout against the position. I think Cade Otton can bounce back here. He has had double-digit fantasy points in 4 out of the last 6 games, so he's still going to remain a solid streaming option for me. Even if Chris Godwin returns this week, I still think ultimately Otton is one of the top pass catchers on this Buccaneers offense. Matthew Stafford, a down week in week 11 in terms of fantasy production. production, just 13.2 fantasy points. He did throw 2 touchdowns, but was 15 of 28, 130 passing yards against Seattle. This week against the Buccaneers, it is a better matchup. The Bucs a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterback. The Rams at home again, and ultimately Stafford has thrown 2 touchdowns or more in every game this year except for 2, and he has had, 25 or more fantasy points in every game since week 4 except for 2, so you got to keep rolling with them. He still has been really good. Super solid start, top 6 quarterback in fantasy right now, so don't overthink it. He's a strong start. Then Tyler Higbee, a bit banged up this past week. Unclear if he's going to play this week or not. He would still be a sit for me. Should have put another tight end up on the screen here. Terrence Ferguson was on the field for 29% of snaps this past week. Colby Parkinson, however, is the more fantasy relevant tight end here, as he has scored a touchdown in 2 straight games, but he has had 5 or less targets, 4 or less catches in the last 2 games. Very low overall volume, but worth keeping an eye on. Sorry, I forgot to put their names on the screen there. Colby Parkinson, if Higbee's out, could be maybe a streaming option if you're absolutely desperate, but ultimately the volume doesn't really give me enough confidence to call him one here in week 12 of the season. All right, let's wrap it up with Monday Night Football. We have the Panthers traveling to face the Niners. Bryce Young, a massive week 11 performance because he was facing the Falcons, his arch nemesis, apparently. 31.8 fantasy points, 448 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. All season highs so far on the season for Bryce Young. This week he will get the Niners, who are a bottom 10 unit against opposing quarterbacks on the season. I still don't trust Bryce Young at all in my fantasy lineup, in your guys' fantasy lineup, in Superflex and anything. I just don't trust him. Don't forget, he had 3.9 or less fantasy points in the previous 2 games, okay? I just can't do it. I know it's not a bad matchup here, but I don't trust him. Maybe there's a floor. Maybe he gets you like 5 fantasy points. I'm just staying away from it. And he is dealing with an ankle issue, which we don't have a clear report on at the time I'm recording this. So we'll see how that shakes out as well. Jatavion Sanders, 6.2 fantasy points this past week. Tommy Tremble, 6.4 fantasy points. So nothing there from a fantasy productive. Tremble on the field for 57% of snaps. Sanders, 48% of the snaps. Not good for fantasy. Let's stay away from it. Brock Purdy, on the other hand, returned to action in week 11 since not being active since week 4 of the season. And I told you guys for weeks and weeks and weeks, it's very unclear week to week. Is it going to be Mac Jones? Is it going to be Brock Purdy? I told you guys, if Brock Purdy plays, start him. He's going to give you guys a very safe floor. He has had 18.7 or more fantasy points in each of his 3 starts, 19.3 this past week, 19 of 26, 200 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. Ultimately, he brings that safe floor. He has weapons. Jawan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall's back. Christian McCaffrey's lighting it up. George Kittle looks as good as ever. Brock Purdy continues to be a solid start on a week in, week out basis. The Panthers defense, quietly good against quarterbacks, top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks, but still Purdy is a strong start. George Kittle, amazing start. The Panthers bottom 12 against opposing tight ends on the season so far. And Kittle was coming off a game where he had 2 touchdowns, 6 targets, 6 catches, 67 receiving yards, 24.7 fantasy points, 23 or more fantasy points in each of his last 2 starts. George Kittle, an absolute, no doubt, must start tight end as we move into the weekend. And there you guys have it. There's every single matchup, every single quarterback, every single tight end, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 12 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So please drop me any of your guys' fantasy questions as the week progresses. I'll answer as many as I can. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor when you guys hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It helps out the channel tremendously. So please consider doing so. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure to go check out all of our week 12 fantasy content. We have everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.